they were not conquered. No foreign army breached their walls, and no rival dynasty ever rose high enough to challenge them. At the height of their power, the Targaryens stood beyond the reach of anything the world could throw at them. So they destroyed themselves. This is the story of the Dance of the Dragons, a civil war between blood, oaths, and two sides that believed the throne was theirs by right. Both had dragons, both had armies, and both had followers willing to die for them. At the start of this war, the Targaryens commanded nearly 20 dragons, the greatest concentration of dragon power since Old Valyria. It should have made them untouchable. By the end, almost every dragon was dead. Within a generation, they were gone entirely. The dynasty built on their fire was left diminished, fragile and exposed. What makes this story impossible to ignore is how avoidable it was. Every step toward disaster was chosen. Every death followed a decision someone believed was right. And it begins with a choice that should have been simple. 100 years before the dance, a man named Aegon crossed the narrow sea with 3 dragons and a vision. He did not have the largest army or the oldest claim. What he had were creatures that could reduce a castle to slag in an afternoon, and the willingness to use them. Within 2 years, 6 of the 7 kingdoms of Westeros had bent the knee. The 7th was brought to heel a generation later. The Targaryen dynasty was established not through diplomacy or inherited right, but through the simple, overwhelming fact of dragons and the credible promise that refusal meant fire. That foundation never changed. 100 years on, as Viserys I Targaryen settled into the middle years of his reign, the Targaryens remained what Aegon's conquest had made them, a family apart. Their hair was silver, their eyes were purple. They married their own kin and kept their bloodline closed, in the Valyrian tradition, because they believed, and the realm had been given every reason to agree, that their blood was different from everyone else's, that it was the blood that made the dragons possible, that without it, the dragons were simply animals, and without the dragons, the Targaryens were simply people. The dragons were not a weapon the Targaryens happened to possess. They were the argument. They were the reason every other great house accepted Targaryen rule rather than challenged it. They made the political order of Westeros legible in a way that no treaty or tradition could, because everyone understood, without needing to be told, what it meant when a shadow with wings passed over your castle walls. The Targaryens' power was so complete that their greatest threat could only ever come from within. In practice, few things from outside could have challenged them. That fact did not make them safe. It made them vulnerable in a direction they were not looking. The reign of Viserys I was by most measures a good one. He was not a conqueror. He had no appetite for war, no taste for cruelty, no particular desire to expand the dynasty's reach beyond what he had inherited. What he wanted, insofar as kings are permitted to want things for themselves, was peace. A realm that functioned, a court that was manageable, a life without the kind of choices that left marks. He was warm to those around him, generous with his favor, and genuinely liked by people across the spectrum of Westerosi politics, which is a rarer quality in a king than it might appear. His reign was long. It was largely prosperous. The realm did not burn under Viserys I. The harvests were reasonable, the borders were quiet. The great lords were not content exactly, because great lords are rarely content, but settled, occupied with their own affairs rather than with rebellion. This peace had a price that no one could see while it was accruing. Viserys I was a man who avoided hard choices. not out of stupidity. He was perceptive enough when he wished to be, not out of cowardice in any simple sense. But he had a deep constitutive discomfort with conflict, with the kind of judgments that would force someone in his court to lose something, and he spent his reign finding ways to defer those judgments rather than make them. In a king, this is a manageable flaw during peaceful times. It becomes something else entirely when the question being deferred is one that the whole realm needs answered. His great failure was not cruelty and not incompetence. It was his lifelong refusal to resolve what his own actions had made irresolvable. He kept the peace so well that he made the war inevitable. The question was succession. Specifically, could a woman inherit the Iron Throne? Westeros had no settled law on the matter. The tradition was based on male preference. Sons before daughters, brothers before sisters. But tradition is not law, and no one had ever tested it at the level of the throne itself. The realm had opinions. Individual lords had opinions. The faith had opinions. But there was no written statute, no definitive ruling, no mechanism for resolution except political will, or, failing that, force. The question had come close to needing an answer once before, when the previous king died without a clear successor. A great council was convened at Harrenhal, the largest such gathering in Westerosi history, with lords from across the realm determining who would rule. The two primary candidates were Viserys and Rhaenys, both grandchildren to the king. Rhaenys had the older claim. Viserys had the male one. The council chose Viserys. They did not choose him because he was better suited, or because Rhaenys was found wanting. They chose him because the lords of Westeros, when pressed to make the matter formal and binding, were not prepared to seat a queen. The principle was established, implicitly if not in writing. Male descent took precedence. The realm had spoken, and then Viserys I, the man that ruling had chosen, moved in a different direction entirely. He named his daughter Rhaenyra his heir. He swore the lords to her. He had them kneel and speak the oaths aloud, one by one, in front of the whole court. He made it as formal and as public as a ceremony could be. In doing so, he did not resolve the succession question. He reopened it. He placed his own declaration directly against the precedent the realm had just established, and he left both standing, unreconciled, for the years and decades that followed. The crack that would eventually swallow everything had been there from the beginning, not caused by one villain, not the product of one bad moment, but built into the structure of the Targaryen succession itself. A question that everyone assumed would resolve itself, that never did, that could not, until the realm answered it the only way it had left, with fire. It begins, as so much in Targaryen history does, with death. Aemma Arryn had been Viserys' queen since before he was king. She was well liked at court, gentle in her manner, and she had given Viserys one surviving child, a daughter, Rhaenyra, across a marriage that had also produced pregnancies that did not last and losses that accumulated quietly over years. By the time she fell pregnant again, in what would be her final pregnancy, the court understood what this child meant. Viserys needed a son. The realm knew it. Aemma knew it. The birth went wrong. The maesters told Viserys that he needed to make a decision, to try to save the child at the cost of the mother. The son she had laboured to deliver, named Balon, for a Targaryen prince of an earlier generation, survived his mother by a single day, and then was gone too. In the space of 2 days, Viserys lost his wife and his heir. What he had left was a daughter, 7 years old, and a throne that the realm expected to pass to a man. Within the year, Viserys made his move. He named Rhaenyra his heir. Not provisionally, not quietly, but formally and publicly, with the full ceremonial weight of the crown behind it. The great lords of Westeros were summoned. They knelt before the girl. They spoke their oaths aloud. They swore on their honor and their houses and everything those words were supposed to mean, that Rhaenyra Targaryen would be their queen when Viserys was gone. The realm accepted this. It had no real alternative. Viserys was the king. The dragons were real, and open defiance was not a practical option. But acceptance is not the same as agreement, and the lords who bent their knees that day did not all bend their minds as well. The precedent of the Great Council a generation before was still there, unaddressed. The tradition of male inheritance was still there, unaddressed. Viserys had placed his declaration on top of both, and trusted that his authority was enough to hold everything in place. He also passed over his brother. Daemon Targaryen was, by almost any measure, the most magnetic and the most dangerous man in Westeros. He was a superb fighter, a natural commander, and instinctively political. He understood power the way a predator understands terrain, not through study, but through something closer to instinct. He rode Caraxes, a dragon called the Blood Worm, lean and serpentine and vicious, a creature that reflected its rider in ways that seemed almost intentional. Daemon was also erratic, violent when it suited him, and completely uninterested in the kind of steady governance that kingship required. Viserys knew this and passed him over for this reason. Daemon left court, returned, was exiled again, caused problems at the edges of the realm, and occasionally at its center. He was the kind of man who could not be fully incorporated and could not be safely ignored. By naming Rhaenyra his heir, Viserys did not settle the succession. He created two legitimate claims where one had existed. Rhaenyra had the oath of the realm. The realm's own precedent supported her brother's claim. And Daemon, passed over and restless, was the fire that would eventually find that powder. Then Viserys remarried. His second wife was Alicent Hightower, young, composed, raised at court, the daughter of Otto Hightower, who served as the king's hand. Otto was a man of considerable intelligence and considerable ambition, and the two things were, in him, impossible to separate. He had maneuvered for this match. He had seen the opening that Aemma's death created and moved toward it with the patience and precision of someone who had been thinking about it before the opportunity existed. What made the marriage more than a political calculation was that Alicent and Rhaenyra had been close, genuinely close. Not the performed friendship of court girls doing what was expected of them, but something real, built over years of proximity and shared experience in the Red Keep. Alicent had been a presence in Rhaenyra's life in the way that matters when you are young, and the world is mostly adults making decisions above your head. The marriage ended that. It could not have done otherwise. Alicent became the queen, and Rhaenyra was the heir, and those two positions pulled in directions that friendship could not ultimately bridge. The rupture was not immediate, and it was not clean. It happened across years, through accumulating grievances and small betrayals, and the slow recognition that they wanted incompatible things. But it happened, and everything that grew from it grew from that ground. The conflict's emotional core does not begin in a throne room or on a battlefield. It begins in a friendship that broke, quietly, across years, before any sword was drawn. Alicent gave Viserys sons. Aegon came first, then Aemond, then Daeron. 3 boys growing up in the Red Keep with silver hair and the Targaryen name, each of them a living argument against Rhaenyra's claim. The realm did not need to be told what this meant. Lords who had sworn to Rhaenyra began, quietly, to reconsider the weight of that oath against the reality of male heirs now in the nursery. The court divided. It did so without a declaration or a formal split. It simply became apparent, over time, that certain people gathered around Rhaenyra and certain people gathered around the Queen, and that these were not the same people. The factions acquired colours, as factions will. Black for Rhaenyra's supporters, green for Alicent's. The names came from a specific moment, a tournament where Alicent appeared in a green gown and Rhaenyra in black. Rhaenyra had been married in the meantime to Laena Velaryon, a match designed to bind the most powerful naval house in Westeros to her cause. Laena was the son of Corlys Velaryon, the sea snake, a man of immense wealth and strategic importance. On paper, the marriage was ideal. In practice, it was a structure with nothing inside it. Laena had no interest in Rhaenyra in the way a husband was expected to. His attentions lay elsewhere, consistently and apparently without great effort at concealment. The marriage produced 3 sons, Jacaerys, Lucerys, and Joffrey. But the boys arrived with dark hair and brown eyes and features that owed nothing to either Rhaenyra's silver Valyrian looks or Laena's. The court whispered a name: Harwin Strong, a knight of the City Watch, large and dark-haired, who was seen with Rhaenyra with a frequency that the whispers found significant. Whether the whispers were correct has never been proven and never will be. What the Greens understood immediately and used without mercy is that the whispers existed at all. A queen whose heirs might be bastards is a queen whose succession can be challenged on grounds that go beyond politics. The question of Jacaerys, Lucerys, and Joffrey's parentage became the Greens' most effective weapon, not because it was resolved, but because it never was. What happened to Laena next is one of the period's murkier episodes. Officially, he died in a brawl. His body burned beyond recognition. Some accounts, though their reliability is uncertain, suggest the death was arranged, that the burned body belonged to someone else, and Laena himself slipped away quietly to a life elsewhere. The truth of it died with the people who knew it. Within days of Laena's reported death, Rhaenyra and Daemon were married. A Valyrian ceremony, private, without the customary mourning period, without seeking the king's blessing in any meaningful way. It was the kind of act that announced itself, that said clearly to anyone paying attention that the Black faction now had a new center of gravity. Daemon's marriage to Rhaenyra transformed the succession dispute into something more dangerous. The Blacks were no longer simply the faction of the named heir. They were a rival court, with their own power, their own dragons, and at their center, the one man in Westeros most likely to treat a civil war as a problem worth solving. Before the first battle, there were 2 islands. Dragonstone, out in the narrow sea, cold and black and carved into the shape of dragons by hands that had been dead for a century. And King's Landing, sprawling and loud and golden when the sun hit it right, the capital of the realm, seat of the Iron Throne. Rhaenyra held Dragonstone. The Greens held King's Landing. And between those 2 places, across a stretch of water that a dragon could cross in an hour, the war was already taking shape before anyone admitted that was what it was. To understand what followed, you need to know who was on each island. Not just the names, the people behind them. The Green Court was built around a family that had decided, collectively, and without quite saying so aloud, that the future belonged to Alicent's sons. Aegon II was the eldest of them, first son of Viserys and Alicent, heir apparent in the eyes of everyone who believed male inheritance was the natural order of things. He was genuinely reluctant. He had not campaigned for the throne, had not spent his years building toward this moment, and liked the pleasures available to a prince who would never, he had assumed, be asked to actually rule. But reluctance at coronation is not the same as weakness in conflict. Once the crown was on, something shifted in Aegon II. The man who had been pushed into kingship became, across the years of the dance, something considerably more dangerous, vindictive in his judgments, capable of sustained cruelty, and utterly committed to a cause he had not chosen but would not relinquish. Framing him as a passive figure, a puppet of his mother's ambition, is wrong. He had agency, and the realm felt it. His brother Aemond was a different creature entirely. He was cold where Aegon was impulsive, precise where his brother was careless, and consumed by an ambition that he was intelligent enough to keep mostly out of view. He rode Vhagar, and this single fact placed him among the most dangerous people alive. Vhagar was the last surviving dragon from Aegon's conquest, old beyond comparison, vast beyond easy description, a creature so large that other dragons looked juvenile beside her. She had carried conquerors. She had burned kingdoms. She was the living weight of 100 years of Targaryen history, and Aemon had claimed her as a boy of 10, alone in the dark, while the adults were sleeping. That act, the claiming of Vhagar, revealed everything about Aemon that his manner was designed to conceal. He was not careful. He was controlled. The difference mattered enormously. Daeron Targaryen, the youngest of Alicent's sons, is the one this story tends to forget. He was stationed in the south, fighting under the Hightower banner, riding his dragon Tessarion, called the Blue Queen, smaller than Vhagar, but fast and fierce. He was, by most accounts, the most conventionally honorable of the three brothers. He tried, in the battles he fought, to limit unnecessary destruction. He cared about the soldiers under his command in a way that his brothers, in their different ways, did not. His death, when it came, would carry the weight of someone who had not deserved what the conflict made of him. Criston Cole was Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, and his loyalty to Alicent was the kind that has become detached from reason, total, personal, unexamined. His hatred of Rhaenyra was old and specific, rooted in something that had happened between them years before, and it shaped his conduct throughout the dance in ways that went well beyond military duty. Otto Hightower was the architect. He had arranged his daughter's marriage to the king, positioned his family at the center of royal power across decades of careful work, and shown himself willing to do things that other men would have found distasteful, because he had long since decided that the outcome justified the method. And then there was Alicent herself. It would be easy, too easy, to make her the villain of this story. She is not. She is a woman who had been brought to court as a girl, married to the king as a political instrument by her own father, and had built her entire identity around her children's survival and their right to be safe. She had once loved Rhaenyra. That love had curdled into something else over years of court life, over the growing certainty that if Rhaenyra took the throne, her sons would not be safe on it. Whether that certainty was justified is one of the period's unanswerable questions. It was the belief she acted on, and she acted on it with everything she had. Now, let us focus on the weapons of mass destruction that were at the center of the Greens' war effort. Aegon rode Sunfear. Gold-scaled, genuinely powerful, beautiful in the way that dangerous things sometimes are. Aemond rode Vhagar. Daeron rode Targaryen. Helena, Aegon's sister wife, a gentle woman with a gift for prophetic dreaming that she had never asked for, rode Dreamfire. Across the water, on Dragonstone, the Black Court had a different shape. Rhaenyra was its centre. A woman who had spent her entire adult life being told that the throne was hers, that the oath of the realm had been sworn, that the promise her father made in front of everyone meant something. She was proud in the way that people become proud when pride is all that stands between them, and the acknowledgement that they have been wronged. She was capable, politically experienced, not naive, aware of the game being played around her, but she had trusted that the formal architecture of succession would hold, and when it did not, that trust became a wound she never stopped bleeding from. Daemon was everything Rhaenyra was not, in the ways that mattered most for what was coming. He had no interest in formal architecture. He was not waiting for the realm to honor its obligations. He understood, at a level that was almost physical, that power exists where people are willing to take it. Together, they were formidable in the way that a fire and a wind are formidable, capable of extraordinary destruction, not always in the direction intended. Rhaenyra's sons by Laena, Jacaerys, Lucerys, and Joffrey were her heirs, her future, and her vulnerability all at once. The questions about their parentage could not be answered and would not go away. Jacaerys, the eldest, rode Vermax and had inherited something of his mother's composure and something of his presumed father's physicality. Lucerys was younger, steadier in some ways, riding Arrax with a care that suited his temperament. Joffrey was still a child. By Daemon, Rhaenyra had two more sons, Aegon the younger and Viserys, whose Targaryen blood was not in question. They were too young to fight. They were not too young to be used. Corlys Velaryon, the sea snake, the most widely travelled man in Westeros, commanded the largest private fleet in the known world. His support for the Blacks was driven not only by political calculation and long-standing Targaryen loyalty, but also by personal stakes. His grandchildren stood to inherit through Rhaenyra's line. The Velaryon fleet became the Blacks' single greatest military asset, dominating the seas, securing supply lines, and projecting power across the realm. Without it, the balance of the war would have looked very different from the very first day. Rhaenys Targaryen, his wife, the queen who never was, had her own reasons, older and heavier than politics. She had been passed over at the Great Council years before. She had watched the realm choose a lesser claim over hers because of her sex. She had lived with that for decades with a dignity that never quite obscured the wound beneath it. She rode Meleys, the Red Queen, fast and battle-hardened. The Blacks also held several dragons without riders, Vermithor, Silverwing, Seasmoke, and others, ranging from ancient to young. They represented enormous potential power. They also represented an enormous problem. Dragons do not accept riders arbitrarily. The bond requires Valyrian or Targaryen blood, or something close enough to it that the dragon cannot tell the difference. Finding people with that blood, people willing to risk the attempt, people who could be trusted with the power if they succeeded, was a problem the Blacks could not solve on the first day. They would come back to it. By the time they did, desperation would be doing most of the thinking. The strategic picture, stripped of everything but its essentials, looked like this. The Blacks had more dragons, more total firepower, spread across more riders, with the potential for more still if the unridden dragons could be claimed. They had the fleet, which controlled the sea lanes and could strangle King's Landing's supply lines. They had the North and the Vale, regions that were distant but loyal and capable of fielding serious armies. The Greens held King's Landing, the capital, the treasury, the institutional machinery of a functioning government. They had the reach through the high towers, which meant the wealthiest and most populous region of Westeros behind their cause. And they had Vhagar, one dragon, one rider, but a force that changed the arithmetic of any engagement she entered. The Blacks had the stronger hand in dragons. The Greens had the stronger position everywhere else. Neither side could simply overwhelm the other. Neither could afford to lose what it had. Viserys I did not die dramatically. There was no final battle, no moment of crisis, no scene in which the king gathered his strength for one last declaration that would settle everything. He simply diminished, across months and then years, the illness taking him apart piece by piece, until what sat on the throne was barely recognizable as the man who had once ruled with warmth and confidence. His fingers went first, lost to a disease that rotted flesh and would not stop. Then his sight began to fail, and his ability to walk without assistance. Finally, his coherence, arriving and departing without pattern. He was carried to court on a litter near the end. The lords who saw him understood what they were seeing. The small council understood what they were seeing. And the Green faction, which had spent years positioning itself for exactly this moment, understood most of all. There is one scene from Viserys I's final weeks that history has never been able to resolve, and the period cannot be fully understood without sitting with that irresolution. The Targaryens carried a prophecy. It had been passed from ruler to heir for generations, kept close, not spoken of openly. A vision that Aegon the Conqueror himself had dreamed, of a darkness coming from the north, of a long winter that would require a Targaryen to stand against it, of a hero the family called the prince that was promised. Viserys had shared this prophecy with Rhaenyra. He had framed it around her and her line. He believed, or had believed, that she was the one the prophecy pointed toward. At a dinner near the end of his life, Viserys spoke. He was barely coherent, drifting in and out of the present, mixing memory with the room he was actually in. He said something about a prince, about a song, about a dream of ice and fire. Alicent heard the word prince and interpreted this as a deathbed reversal. Her husband, in his final hours, endorsing their son Aegon. She held on to this. She would hold on to it for the rest of her life, in the way that people hold on to the interpretations they need to be true. Most believe Viserys meant the prophecy, the prince that was promised, the dream he had shared with his daughter, not his wife, years before. He was likely not changing his position on succession in his final hours. He was not capable, by that point, of the sustained clarity that such a change would have required. Whether she genuinely misunderstood or chose to hear what she needed, that question died with Viserys. Everything that followed from her interpretation is the entire rest of this story. Viserys I died in his bed, alone, without ceremony. The news did not reach the small council immediately. It reached Otto Hightower, and Otto Hightower made a move. The king's death would not be announced. Not yet. Not until the position was secured. The next 2 days was one of the most precisely executed political maneuvers in Westerosi history. Not because it was complicated, but because it was fast, and because speed, in that specific window, was everything. The small council convened in secret. Not all of it. Only the members whose loyalty was not in question, or whose opposition could be managed. Lord Lyman Beesbury, the master of coin, objected immediately and forcefully. He was silenced. Accounts differ on whether he was imprisoned or killed, but he did not leave that room to raise the alarm. The rest of the council proceeded. No ravens flew from King's Landing in those hours. None that carried word of the king's death. None that might have reached Dragonstone before the thing was done. Lords, whose loyalty was uncertain, were watched. The gold cloaks were brought into alignment. The sept was prepared, and Aegon II was found. He had not been present at the council and had not been part of the planning. He was located, informed, dressed, and pushed toward a crown he had not known, until that morning he was about to receive. He was crowned at the Dragon Pit. The location was not incidental. The Dragon Pit was where the Targaryen dragons were housed, the most visible symbol of what the dynasty was and what it could do. Crowning Aegon there placed him inside that symbol, associated him with the power behind the throne, rather than simply the throne itself. Sunfire was nearby. The imagery was deliberate. The city was prepared to receive this. The announcement was made with sufficient ceremony and confidence that it carried its own momentum. People who might have hesitated, who might have said wait, were given no space in which to say it. The crowd that gathered cheered, partly because the crowd had been prepared to cheer, partly because the idea of a king rather than a queen was not unwelcome to significant portions of the realm, and partly because crowds tend to follow the energy of the moment they are placed in. By the time word reached Dragonstone that Viserys I was dead, Aegon II was already king. The coronation had happened. The fact existed. Here is what matters about those 48 hours. The Greens did not have the stronger claim. They did not have the oaths of the realm. Those had been sworn to Rhaenyra, before witnesses, in public, with the full authority of the crown behind them. The legal argument was genuinely contested, and had been for years. What they had was the capital, the council, the gates, the ravens, the 2 days in which Viserys' body lay in his chambers, and the world outside did not yet know it. They used all of it. The first move in the Dance of the Dragons was not a battle. It was not a dragon taking flight or an army crossing a field. It was a group of people in a room deciding, in the hours after a king's death, to act faster than anyone who might object. The war that followed, the dragons, the blood, the years of destruction, all of it flows from those 2 days, from the judgment to move before anyone could stop them, from a council meeting that most of the realm didn't know had happened until it was already over. The news arrived at Dragonstone in the form of 2 facts delivered almost simultaneously. Viserys I was dead, and Aegon II was king, not king in waiting. King, crowned, proclaimed, sitting on the Iron Throne in the capital, while the Dragon Pit still smelled of ceremony. The Greens had moved so quickly and so completely that by the time Rhaenyra learned her father was gone, the thing done in his absence was already a settled fact. There was no window in which to act first, because the window had been closed from the inside before she even knew it existed. Rhaenyra collapsed. This is not metaphor. The shock of the news, the death and the betrayal arriving together, indistinguishable from each other, sent her into premature labor. The child she had been carrying, a daughter, came too early and did not survive. Rhaenyra named her Visenya, after an ancestor, and then she was gone. The smallest casualty of a war that had not yet officially begun. The first thing the dance took before anyone had drawn a sword or lit a torch. When Rhaenyra recovered enough to stand, she called her council. The people who gathered in the great hall of Dragonstone that day were not optimists. They knew what the Greens had: King's Landing, the treasury, the machinery of governance, the ability to send ravens across the entire realm under the seal of the crown, framing Aegon's coronation as the legitimate succession and Rhaenyra's claim as the rebellion. They knew that Otto Hightower had been preparing for this moment across years of careful work. What the Black Council had against all of that was dragons, more of them than the Greens. The question the council had to answer was what to do with them. Daemon wanted to act. This surprised no one. He had always believed that speed and force, applied before the other side had finished thinking, solved more problems than patience and diplomacy. His argument was direct. Rhaenyra had more dragons. The window in which that advantage could be decisively used was closing with every hour they spent talking. Fly to King's Landing. Fly now. End this before it becomes a long war. Rhaenyra did not agree. This is a moment the story tends to compress, but it deserves its full weight. Rhaenyra, in the hours after losing her father and her daughter in the same breath, made the harder call. Not the emotionally satisfying one, not the one that matched her grief, but the strategically considered one. She understood something that Daemon's argument skipped over. Arriving at King's Landing with dragons and destroying the city was not the same thing as winning. You could burn the capital and still lose. You could kill your brother and find that the lords who had been wavering now had an atrocity to rally against, rather than an oath to honor. Power is not only fire. Sometimes it is patience and letters and the careful assembly of support that does not evaporate when the first thing goes wrong. She chose the middle path. Send her sons as envoys by dragon before committing to open war. Jacaerys would fly north, to the Vale first, then to Winterfell, to secure those alliances formally. Lucerys would fly to Storm's End, to bring Lord Boros Baratheon into the Black cause. It was the right instinct. It was also slower than what was happening on the other side of the narrow sea. While the Black Council deliberated, the ravens were already flying. Both sides dispatched them simultaneously across the realm. Every great house in Westeros found itself holding 2 letters. One from King's Landing, bearing the seal of Aegon II, informing them that the king was dead and his son had been crowned, that their loyalty to the new reign was expected. One from Dragonstone bearing Rhaenyra's seal, informing them that the king was dead and his named heir was claiming what she had been promised and their oath. Every lord read both letters and then sat with them and thought about his castle and his children and his treasury and the colour of the sky on the side that dragons would come from if he chose wrong. Most of them did not choose immediately. Delay was itself a kind of position. It said, I am waiting to see which way this falls before I commit my house to either direction. The lords who declared quickly tended to do so on the basis of genuine loyalty or genuine calculation. The rest watched. The North, however, had made its decision. Word came back from Winterfell that House Stark would honour its oath. An oath sworn was an oath kept. That was not poetry in the North. It was policy. The Vale followed. These were not small things. They were distant, yes, and their armies would take time to move south, but their declarations shifted the shape of the struggle before a single battle had been fought. In King's Landing, Alicent watched the ravens go and understood something that the victory of her son's coronation had not quite obscured. She had wanted this. She had worked for it, believed in it, told herself across years that it was right and necessary. Her son was on the throne. The thing she had given everything toward had happened, and the realm was dividing. The letters coming back from great lords were not unanimous. The north was gone. The Vale was gone. The Valyrians, with their fleet and their dragons, were gone. The conflict she had told herself might be avoided, that Rhaenyra might accept the reality of the situation and stand down, was not going to be avoided. She had put her son on the throne. She was beginning to understand what keeping him there would require. The ravens kept flying, the lords kept choosing, and on Dragonstone, Rhaenyra's sons climbed onto their dragons and set upon their task. Before the first blade is drawn, before the first dragon takes flight over a battlefield, there is a quieter and in some ways more consequential struggle. The one fought with letters and messengers, and the slow, careful calculation of which side offers more and demands less. The dance of the dragons was decided, in significant part, before it was fought. The positions taken by the great lords of Westeros in the weeks after Aegon's coronation determined which battles would need to happen. The Greens moved into this phase with the advantages of incumbency. They held the capital, the treasury, and the seal of the crown. This meant their letters carried the weight of established authority rather than insurgent claim. Otto Hightower understood, better than almost anyone on either side, that the contest of ravens was as important as the contest of dragons. Lords who declared for Aegon received confirmation of their lands and titles. Lords who hesitated received visits from men who explained, with varying degrees of subtlety, what hesitation might eventually cost them. The Hightowers themselves brought the reach, the wealthiest and most populous region of Westeros, its fields, armies, and its gold flowing into the green cause from the beginning. The Crown lands, in proximity to King's Landing, followed the capital as crownlands tend to do. And beyond Westeros itself, the Greens contracted the Triarchy, a mercantile alliance from the disputed lands across the narrow sea, to provide naval muscle against the Valyrian fleet that the Blacks were counting on to control the water. Against this, the Blacks assembled a coalition of their own. The North and the Vale provided the moral legitimacy of houses honouring oaths they had openly sworn. The Riverlands were contested. This area was geographically central, politically divided, with individual lords making calculations that did not always align with their lieges. House Tully of River Run declared for the Blacks, which meant the Riverlands were theoretically Black territory. This meant almost nothing in practice because the River Lords did not follow Tully with anything like unanimity. Viserys Targaryen flew to Storm's End on his dragon Arrax in the early days of the struggle. He was carrying his mother's letter, and whatever confidence a boy could muster when the errand he had been sent on was the kind that shaped history. Storm's End is not a place that encourages optimism. It sits on the edge of Shipbreaker Bay, where the winds come off the water with a violence that has been sinking ships since before anyone was counting. The castle itself looks like it was built by someone who had made a private resolution never to be comfortable again. Lord Boros Baratheon received Lucerys there, and he found, when he arrived, that he was not the first. Aemon Targaryen had been there before him. Aemon had arrived carrying an offer, a marriage alliance between House Baratheon and House Targaryen. One of Aegon's daughters promised to one of Boros's sons a concrete and immediate reward for the declaration the Greens needed. When Lucerys arrived with his letter and his mother's claim on an old oath, Boros looked at the two propositions in front of him and made the calculation that men in his position make. Rhaenyra was asking him to honour something sworn in a different time. Aegon was offering him something now. Boros chose the Greens in that room, in that conversation, partly because one side had brought him something and the other had not. Lucerys left Storm's End empty-handed. No alliance, no comfort, and the awareness that he had failed the errand he had been sent to complete. He did not make it home. Aemond followed him out of Storm's End, climbing onto Vhagar as Lucerys climbed onto Arrax. What happened next over the waters of Shipbreaker Bay was not ordered by anyone and was not part of any military strategy. It was personal. Aemond and Lucerys had a history, a childhood incident involving the claiming of Vhagar that had left Aemond without an eye. Aemond, with all of Vhagar's power beneath him and no one present to tell him to stop, chose to avenge that childhood slight. Vhagar killed Arrax. Lucerys died with his dragon, somewhere above Shipbreaker Bay, 16 years old, on an errand for his mother. The first dragon rider of the dance was gone. After that, it only got worse. The news reached Dragonstone and did what grief does when it arrives with sufficient force. It changed the person it landed on. Rhaenyra had chosen restraint. She had chosen the slower path, the politically careful path, the path that kept options open and avoided the kind of irrevocable acts that foreclosed negotiation. Lucerys' death was such an act. The restraint she had been maintaining snapped under the weight of it. What replaced it was something colder and less careful. The events that followed are one of the period's most disputed questions, and they should be treated as such. Two men entered the Red Keep in King's Landing. One was a gold-cloaked deserter known as Blood. The other was a rat-catcher who worked the castle walls, known as Cheese. They knew the castle's hidden passages, its forgotten corridors, the routes that the walls and the rats had made invisible to the people who lived there. They reached the chambers of Queen Helena, Aegon's sister wife, mother of his children, a woman who had never been a political actor in any meaningful sense, and they did what they had come to do. They told her to choose which of her sons would die. She chose the younger, hoping he might be spared. They killed the elder instead, 6 years old, Aegon's heir. Then they were gone, back into the walls, back into the city. They left Helena behind in a room that had become something she would never truly leave, not for whatever time she had remaining. She descended into a grief the people around her called madness. They had no better word for what complete destruction looks like from the outside. She is believed to have taken her own life sometime later. The accounts of her final days differ, but she remains one of the war's most complete casualties. A woman undone entirely by the actions of others. The hand that sent Blood and Cheese into the Red Keep pointed toward Daemon. Whether it also pointed toward Rhaenyra is a question that cannot be answered. The sources disagree. The Maester historians who recorded these events took different positions, and the truth of what Rhaenyra knew, when she knew it, and whether she sanctioned it or simply did not ask, that truth died with the people who held it. Daemon arranging it without her explicit knowledge is too clean for a situation this dark. Rhaenyra ordering the murder of a child is not supported by what the sources actually say. Daemon arranged it, that much is certain, and the question of Rhaenyra's awareness is one that history has left genuinely open. Alicent learned what had been done to her grandson in the castle she had fought to secure. She had wanted her son on the throne. She had believed, across years of maneuvering and sacrifice, that putting him there was the right thing. For him, for her family, for the realm. Jaehaerys was 6 years old. He had been killed in his own chambers, in the strongest castle in Westeros, while the adults responsible for his safety had been busy managing a struggle that was barely weeks old. The throne had already extracted this toll, and the fighting had barely begun. Beyond the murder of a child, what blood and cheese produced was the permanent removal of any remaining possibility of negotiation. Lucerys's death had made peace difficult. Jaehaerys's murder made it impossible. Both sides had now done something that the other could not forgive and would not forget, and the lords watching from their castles understood that this war would not end with a letter or a council. It would end when one side was no longer capable of continuing. The choosing of sides was over. The actual war, the one with dragons and armies and years of consequence, was about to begin. Wars have a momentum of their own. Once the letters have been sent and the sides have been chosen and the first blood has been drawn, there is a logic that takes over. Not the logic of strategy or politics, but something more like gravity. Events pull other events toward them. Actions in one place create necessities somewhere else. The people who started the conflict find themselves quickly doing things they had not planned and responding to things they had not anticipated. War does not wait for anyone to be ready. The Dance of the Dragons, in its opening phase, was fought on two surfaces simultaneously. It was fought on the water, where the Valyrian fleet made the Blacks the dominant naval power from the beginning. It was fought on the land, where armies moved through the riverlands in the grinding, attritional way that armies move when the terrain is contested and the cause is complicated. Neither surface was decisive on its own. Together, they established the shape of a struggle that would last years and consume far more than anyone standing in that first season had imagined they were committing to. The Riverlands were the land war's first and primary theatre, and they were the worst possible place for a prolonged campaign. Worst not because of terrain. The Riverlands are gentle country, rivers and fields and rolling hills, nothing that naturally favours either attacker or defender. Worst because of their political character. The River Lords were not a unified force. They had sworn to their liege, House Tully of River Run, and Tully had declared for the Blacks. But the individual lords of the Riverlands had their own histories, their own grievances, their own calculations about which way this would fall. Some followed Tully without hesitation. Others found reasons not to. A few declared openly for the Greens. The result was a war within the war. Neighbour against neighbour. Houses that had coexisted for generations now burning each other's crops and taking each other's people. They were accumulating the kind of local bitterness that outlasts the larger struggle by decades. The green armies that moved through the Riverlands did so under Criston Cole. He was organised, methodical, capable of sustaining a campaign across months without losing cohesion. He was not a man given to unnecessary cruelty, but he was a man given to absolute commitment. Absolute commitment in contested territory produces its own kind of devastation. Castles that refused to yield were taken by force. Lords who had declared for the Blacks and been captured found that the mercy available to them was limited. The Black response on land was less coordinated, because the Blacks' greatest assets were dragons and ships. Neither of those moved through fields the way infantry did. Where dragons appeared over Riverlander engagements, the balance shifted immediately and completely. Where they didn't, which was most of the time, the fighting was the kind that leaves landscapes changed and populations diminished. Dragons cannot be everywhere, and riders cannot be in multiple places simultaneously. That fighting resolved nothing cleanly. Jaehaerys Targaryen returned from the north, having done exactly what he was sent to do. He had flown to the Vale and secured House Arryn's declaration. He had flown to Winterfell and spoken with Lord Cregan Stark. What he found there was the North's particular variety of commitment. It was not warm, not effusive, but absolute in the way that things are absolute when they are rooted in principle rather than calculation. Cregan Stark would honor the oath his house had sworn to Rhaenyra. When the time came, the North would march. Jacaerys returned to Dragonstone with 2 more great houses formerly in the Black Coalition. He had conducted himself with a composure that men twice his age would have found difficult to maintain. He was the best of what Rhaenyra had produced. He was capable, clear-headed, trusted by the people he dealt with. The war needed more of him and had him for less time than it deserved. There is a kind of military thinking that treats the battlefield as secondary to what happens before anyone arrives at it. Criston Cole was that kind of thinker. He understood that the Blacks' greatest advantage was not their army. The Black armies were not significantly superior to the Green ones in the open field. Their advantage was their dragons. More riders, more beasts, more fire available at shorter notice. As long as that advantage held, the Greens were fighting a struggle in which the decisive factor was always beyond their reach. The way to change that was not to build a larger army or find a better general. It was to find a way to remove the dragons, one at a time, in circumstances that the Greens controlled. You could not chase a dragon. You could not corner one in open sky. But you could make a dragon come to you if you gave it a reason. Rook's Rest was a castle on the Crownland's coast, held by a Black-aligned lord. Cole marched a Green army to its walls and began a siege. He was not primarily interested in Rook's Rest. The castle was not strategically vital, not a great prize worth the effort of a serious campaign. He was sending a message to Dragonstone. There is a castle burning. There are your people under siege. There are your obligations as a queen, and one of them is to answer when your bannermen call for help. Rhaenyra would send a dragon. Cole intended to be ready for it. The dragon that came was Meleys, the Red Queen, one of the fastest in the world, ridden by Rhaenys Targaryen. Rhaenys was not the obvious choice in the sense of being the most powerful option available, but she was an experienced rider, a genuine dragon rider rather than a ceremonial one, and Meleys was formidable in ways that went beyond size. Speed matters in the air. Experience matters. Rhaenys had both. She arrived expecting what any rider might expect when responding to an infantry siege. She expected soldiers, archers, the ordinary instruments of a land campaign that a dragon overflies and breaks with fire. She was not expecting what rose to meet her. 2 dragons came up from concealment when Meleys appeared over Rook's Rest. Sunfire, ridden by Aegon II, and Vhagar, ridden by Aemond. What happened next is something the sources argue about with a pointed quality. The people recording these events understood the stakes of the argument. What is established? The engagement was not a clean 2 against 1 fought in coordinated fashion. Aemond and Vhagar were not immediately decisive. Sunfire and Meleys fought, while Vhagar's involvement was delayed. Whether that delay was tactical, waiting for the right moment to enter, is disputed. Whether it was strategic, holding Vhagar in reserve against a larger engagement that might follow, is also disputed. Whether it reflected something else entirely is a question that the sources raise without answering. What might happen if Sunfire and Meleys damaged each other severely while Vhagar stayed whole? Aemond was not a man whose actions were assumed to be innocent by those around him. He was too controlled, too intelligent, too clearly ambitious for his behavior to be taken at face value. Whether their suspicion was correct is something history cannot confirm. Vhagar entered the battle, and the largest dragon alive was fully committed to it. Meleys fought with everything she had. Rhaenys was not a rider who surrendered. She drove Meleys hard, through fire, and through the violence of a three-way aerial engagement. It would have been chaos even for experienced riders. It was not enough. The queen who never was went out in a manner that the songs would make glorious. In reality, it was simply the end. A woman and her dragon destroyed in the sky above a castle that neither of them had strong feelings about. Aegon II survived. Survived is perhaps the generous word. Sunfire was grievously wounded. The dragon would bear those wounds for the rest of his life, which was not long, though no one knew that yet. Aegon himself was burned. Seriously, extensively burned, in the way that happens when you are in proximity to dragonfire during an engagement between dragons. He was pulled from the field, barely conscious. He would spend months recovering, and the recovery was never complete. He would carry what Rook's rest did to him for the rest of his life. The practical consequence was immediate. The Green King was incapacitated. The war had a king on paper and a dead man's weight in practice. The people who needed to keep fighting had to do so without the authority that a functioning monarch provides. Aemond and Criston Cole moved to fill that gap. Aemond brought the dragon and Cole brought the army. The two of them effectively ran the green effort between them. This mattered because Aemond, without a king above him, was a different proposition from Aemond as a prince following orders. Cole was a disciplined man, a man of structure and hierarchy. But Cole's hierarchy had a hole in it now. Aemond, who had never been entirely comfortable within hierarchies he hadn't chosen, operated in that hole with a freedom that the war's subsequent course would reflect. Rook's rest was a green victory. A dragon was gone. A dragon rider was gone. The Blacks had lost Rhaenys, experienced, committed, the kind of rider who cannot simply be replaced by finding someone else willing to climb onto a dragon. It was also the engagement that removed the Green King from the field. The Greens had won. They had paid for it in ways that would not be fully visible until later. The bill came due in the shape of a war fought without a king. It was directed by a prince whose ambitions no one had ever fully trusted, aimed at a capital whose population was already beginning to fracture under the weight of everything the fighting had brought to their door. The Gullet is the narrow strait between Dragonstone and Driftmark, the gateway through which any fleet must pass to reach Blackwater Bay and the harbours of King's Landing beyond it. Whoever controls the Gullet controls the capital's connection to the sea, and from the beginning, the Blacks had controlled it through the simple, overwhelming fact of the Valyrian fleet. Corlys Velaryon had spent decades and an enormous fortune building the finest private navy in the world, and that navy sat across the Gullet like a door that the Greens could not open. The Greens needed to open it. Without the sea lanes, King's Landing could be strangled, slowly, expensively, but with the kind of certainty that comes from geography rather than military genius. They contracted the Triarchy to force the passage. The Triarchy was a mercantile and military alliance from the disputed lands across the narrow sea. Experienced fighters, experienced sailors, with a fleet large enough and a fee agreed upon, and no particular loyalty to either side beyond the gold that was paying them. They came in force, and the Blacks met them. Jacaerys Targaryen commanded the dragon response above the Gullet, flying Vermax over the engagement, while the Valyrian galleys fought the Triarchy fleet on the water below. What a naval battle looks like from Dragonback is not something many people have survived to describe in detail. The ships were packed close in the narrow strait, the Triarchy pushing through, the Valyrians holding the line, the water between them churned by oars and wind, and the movement of vessels trying to close with each other, and vessels trying not to be closed with. From above, Jacaerys could see the shape of it, could see where the pressure was building, where the line was thinning, where fire from Vermax could break a concentration of Triarchy ships before they punched through to the open water beyond. He was not alone. Other dragons flew that day, younger ones, smaller ones, ridden by riders who were themselves young and untested. It was the kind of engagement that forces a side to use everything it has, not because it is ready, but because it cannot afford not to. Jacaerys died above the Gullet, though the exact manner of his death is something the sources cannot agree on. Vermax went down. Whether Jacaerys was struck by the scorpion bolt, or whether the dragon's fall killed him, these are questions that history has left open. What is not in doubt is that he did not come home from the Gullet. Vermax did not come home. The heir to the Black Cause, the boy who had secured the North and the Vale and demonstrated that Rhaenyra's sons were capable of exactly the kind of steady, trustworthy conduct the struggle required. He was gone. The Triarchy fleet was broken. The Blacks won the Battle of the Gullet. The Strait remained in Black hands. The sea lanes into King's Landing stayed contested. By the military logic of the engagement, the Blacks had achieved their objective. They had held what they needed to hold, and the Triarchy would not threaten the Gullet again with anything like that force. That is technically true. It is also the kind of truth that illustrates the problem with measuring a war by its individual engagements, over what those engagements extract. The Blacks had lost, in the Battle of the Gullet, their heir and one of their most capable dragon riders. They had lost the young man who, of everyone in the Black Coalition, seemed most capable of becoming the thing the war was being fought to produce. A ruler. A victory that extracts this much is not a victory in any sense that sustains a long campaign. It buys time and nothing else, and the time it buys has a price attached that does not stop accruing. The Blacks held the Gullet. They had secured the sea, but the cost of doing so had reshaped what victory would even mean for them. The war continued. The Blacks had fewer people to fight it with, and the people they had left were carrying more weight than anyone had designed them to carry. The Valyrian fleet, under Corlys Valerian's command, controlled the waters around King's Landing with a thoroughness that turned the capital's strategic position from an advantage into a vulnerability. King's Landing needed to be fed. It needed timber and grain and goods from across the realm, and those things moved by ship. When the ships stopped moving freely, the city began to feel it. Every merchant vessel had to calculate whether the waters were safe, and found consistently that they were not. Not immediately, not in ways that produced crisis in the first weeks, but steadily, the way that pressure builds in a place with no release. The Greens understood what the fleet meant. The contracts with the Triarchy were, in part, an answer to it. The naval dimension was not incidental to the land campaign. It was the war's circulatory system, determining what could be sustained and for how long. By the time Rhaenyra turned toward King's Landing, the Green Court was no longer truly there. Aegon II was broken from Rook's Rest, his body failing him, his authority reduced to something that could not leave a bed. Aemond, the most dangerous man on their side, was not in the capital. He was in the field with Vhagar, fighting a different war in a different place. Criston Cole was with him. The army was with him. What remained in King's Landing was not the Green War effort. It was its shadow. A court without its king. A city without its defenders. A capital waiting for something to happen to it. The Valyrian fleet controlled the bay. Supplies were tightening. The city was already beginning to fail. There was no great assault on King's Landing, no ladders raised, no walls broken. When Rhaenyra's forces arrived, the gates were already open. The city watch, the men meant to defend the capital, had chosen their side. Her soldiers walked into the city, the dragons following overhead, and by the time anyone thought to resist, it was already over. Rhaenyra entered King's Landing and sat on the Iron Throne. She was the first woman to do so. She had been promised this since childhood. The throne was cold, as everyone who has written about it notes, and it was uncomfortable. Rhaenyra sat on it, and she was queen. It was the thing the oath had promised. It was the thing the Greens had tried to prevent with 48 hours of coordinated action and years of positioning before that. The treasury was empty. The Greens had taken the gold when they fled. The grain stores were low. The war had broken the supply lines that kept the capital fed. Plague had entered the city walls. It had been carried by whom, from where? In the way that plague arrives in crowded places during wars without leaving a clear record of its entry point. The city watch was unreliable. The court she had inherited was full of people whose loyalty had been to the previous occupants and who were making fresh calculations about the new ones. She had the throne, she had the castle, she had the city, and the city was a problem that dragons could not solve. You cannot burn a famine into abundance or frighten plague into retreating. The things that were killing King's Landing were not the kind of things that responded to fire. She had won the capital. What she had won it into was something she had not fully prepared for. It was a position that looked like victory from the outside. From the inside, it felt like standing on ground that was already shifting beneath her feet. Rhaenyra held the Iron Throne for roughly half a year. In the history of Targaryen reigns, half a year is not a reign. It is an interruption, a parenthesis, a period that later historians would struggle to categorize because it had all the formal attributes of rule and almost none of the practical ones. She sat on the throne. She issued decrees. She held court. She was, by every available legal definition, the queen. She could not feed the city. She could not pay the soldiers. She could not stop the plague. And she could not, in the end, stop the war from finding her inside the walls she had worked so hard to take. What collapsed her position was not a single catastrophic defeat. It was the accumulated weight of everything. It was the knowledge, arriving in pieces, that the military situation outside the capital was not improving in the way she needed it to improve. And it was the dragon seeds, the gamble that had been her most creative move and became her most destructive one. The dragon seeds had begun as a solution to a specific problem. The Blacks had unridden dragons. Dragons without riders are not military assets. They are animals, powerful and dangerous, but without direction. To use them, you needed riders. To have riders of Valyrian dragons, you needed Valyrian blood, or something close enough to it. The Targaryens and the Valyrians had produced that blood through legitimate lines, but the legitimate lines had been running thin since the Gullet. What remained, in the byways and the harbour districts and the rough edges of the realm, was the blood that had been left behind, the bastards, the unacknowledged get of Valyrian lords who had not always been faithful to their marriages or careful about what they left in their wake. Rhaenyra opened the call. Anyone who could claim Valyrian ancestry, proven or not, was invited to attempt a dragon bond. The candidates who arrived at Dragonstone were not, for the most part, the kind of people who had previously been invited to Dragonstone for anything. They were rough, some of them desperate. many of them motivated primarily by the calculation that the rewards available to a dragon rider were worth the risk of being killed by a dragon in the attempt. 4 of them succeeded. Nettles was perhaps the most remarkable, a young girl of unclear origin and no apparent Valyrian ancestry who bonded with Sheepstealer not through blood, but through patience. She came to the dragon every day with a freshly killed sheep and waited, and kept waiting, until the dragon accepted her. Whether this worked because she had Valyrian blood that her appearance obscured, or whether Sheepstealer simply decided, in the way that dragons apparently sometimes decide, that this particular human had earned something, that question was never resolved. She rode him. She fought with him. She was, for a time, one of the Black's most effective dragon assets. Adam of Hull bonded with Seasmoke, claimed to be a Valyrian bastard, which was plausible enough given Seasmoke's previous rider, and the bond confirmed something in the claim, even if the paperwork did not. He was granted legitimacy by Corlys Velaryon himself, an act that carried its own political weight and its own complications. Ulf the White and Hugh Hammer were different propositions entirely. Ulf was a drinker and a braggart who bonded with Silverwing and immediately began behaving as though the dragon had confirmed everything he had always believed about his own importance. Hugh was a blacksmith's son, physically enormous, quiet in the unsettling way of people who have nothing to prove, who bonded with Vermithor, the second largest dragon alive after Vagar, a creature so vast that his bonding gave the Blacks a military asset that should, in theory, have changed the balance of the struggle. In theory. The problem with giving power to people who have no binding reason to be loyal is that it tends to surface at the moment when loyalty matters most. Tumbleton was not a great city. It was a market town on the Manda River, the kind of place that exists in every realm. Useful, moderately prosperous, full of people who had built lives around the assumption that the large events of the world would pass them by, or at least pass through them without stopping. It had a market square, and a sept, and a castle of middling size, and the kind of community that accumulates across generations when a place sits at the intersection of roads that people actually use. It was also the most strategically important point in the southern approach to King's Landing, which meant that the Dance of the Dragons had decided, without consulting the people who lived there, that Tumbleton was where something was going to happen. Something would happen there twice. Hugh Hammer and Ulf the White defected during the campaign toward Tumbleton. They did not defect to the Greens exactly, not in the sense of having been recruited or turned through Green intelligence operations. They defected toward themselves, toward the rewards they felt their dragons entitled them to, and that Rhaenyra had not provided with sufficient speed or generosity. Hugh spoke of wanting a crown. Ulf wanted a castle, a great one, commensurate with the power he was now riding above everyone else's head. Rhaenyra had given them dragons, and not enough of what dragons, in their minds, were supposed to unlock. When the moment came, they turned, and the Black Force at the First Battle of Tumbleton found itself being attacked by 2 of its own dragons. Tumbleton burned. The town that was supposed to be held as part of a Black defensive line was taken, partly by fire from above provided by men who had been eating at Rhaenyra's table weeks earlier. Adam of Hull fought for the Blacks at Tumbleton and fought well, demonstrating that the Dragon Seed program had not failed uniformly, that the question of loyalty was individual rather than categorical, and that the difference between Adam and Hugh was not the dragons they rode, but the people they were. This distinction mattered to almost no one in King's Landing. where news of Tumbleton arrived as news of a catastrophe rather than a complicated story with honourable exceptions. Rhaenyra moved to arrest Adam of Hull on suspicion of potential treachery, tarring him with the same presumption as the dragon riders who had actually betrayed her. It was the kind of judgment that cost Rhaenyra one of her few remaining functional military assets, along with the confidence of the man whose fleet was her most important strategic advantage. King's Landing had rarely been a city that loved its rulers. It was too large for that, too various, too full of people who had come from somewhere else and brought with them the skepticism of those who have seen enough of the world. The small folk of King's Landing had lived through enough reigns to understand that what happened in the Red Keep was primarily the business of the Red Keep. The experience of ordinary people in the city bore only an indirect and often painful relationship to the decisions made inside those walls. The people had not chosen this war. They had not been asked. The two claimants to the Iron Throne had fought over the capital like two people fighting over a house without consulting the people who lived in it. The people who lived in it were now experiencing the consequences. Those consequences were the empty grain stores, the rising prices, the plague that had found the crowded streets, and the damp buildings, and the weakened population. The plague had settled in with the comfort of something that has found exactly the conditions it requires. Rhaenyra held the city. The city was dying around her. It was beginning to understand, in the way that hungry and frightened populations come to understand things, that the dragons perched on the hill above them were not protecting them from any of this. They were, in some sense, that the logic of desperation makes legible, the reason for it. Into this, a man began to preach. He was known as the Shepherd. No other name was recorded, no origin clearly established. He was a figure who appeared in the streets of King's Landing, as such figures sometimes do in cities under sufficient pressure, as though the desperation itself had generated him. He stood in the market squares and the open spaces near the city gates, and he told people what they were already feeling. He told it in a language that made the feeling into something larger than individual suffering. The dragons were abominations. They were against the gods. They had been brought into a city where they did not belong by people who did not care what happened to the city's inhabitants. The sickness and the hunger and the death that surrounded the small folk on every side were the consequence of tolerating what should not be tolerated. The gods were not punishing the people of King's Landing. They were punishing the dragon lords, and the people of King's Landing were caught in the middle of a punishment they had done nothing to deserve. This is a particular kind of argument. It takes the suffering and gives it a cause that is visible and proximate and, crucially, not the fault of the people suffering. It removes helplessness by providing a target. The shepherds' congregations grew. Rhaenyra knew he was there. She did not move against him with sufficient speed or sufficient force. That is the kind of mistake that seems like a small thing while it is happening and reveals its scale only afterward. She was managing too many problems simultaneously, none of which had clean solutions, all of which demanded attention. The preacher in the streets was one among many, rather than the one that would end her reign. The mob formed on a night in late autumn. It did not form from nothing. It formed from weeks of the shepherd's preaching, from months of hunger, from the accumulated weight of a city that had been handed from one claimant to another and fed nothing but promises in between. It formed from the particular alchemy that happens when enough people in the same place reach the same breaking point at the same time, and someone tells them which direction to walk. They walk toward the dragon pit that sat on Rhaenys' hill. It was the great dome structure built to house the Targaryen dragons, the most visible symbol in the city of the dynasty's power, and the dynasty's difference from everyone else. From the outside, it looked impregnable. From the inside, it was designed to keep dragons contained, not to keep people out. Its gates were built for the scale of dragons, not for the scale of thousands of desperate people with torches and whatever they had pulled from their homes and workshops that could serve as a weapon. Rhaenyra's guards were spread across too many commitments. The garrison was thin. By the time anyone understood what the crowd's destination was, the crowd was already there. What happened inside the dragon pit that night was not a victory for anyone. Joffrey Valerian died in the chaos that preceded it. Too young, too untested. With the city slipping out of control, he tried to reach his dragon. Instead, he mounted Syrax, his mother's dragon, a creature that did not know him. Dragons are not horses, and they are not interchangeable. Syrax threw him. He fell to his death within the city his mother had only just taken. The mob killed dragons. Shrykos was young, not yet fully grown. Morgul was similarly young. Both of them died before they had become what they might have been. Tyraxes thrashed against his chains in a panic that made him simultaneously more vulnerable and more dangerous to the people surrounding him. And Dreamfire, Helena's dragon, the dragon of a woman who was herself already broken, who had not been capable of riding for months. The dragons did not die without response. They burned, they killed, in numbers that the sources are vague about, but that were clearly enormous. People were caught in dragonfire in an enclosed space. People were crushed. People were killed by the panic of the crowd turning on itself as the exits were blocked and the fire was everywhere. The dark was filled with sounds that no one present ever forgot. The mob that destroyed the dragons paid in bodies for what it did. Dreamfire was mortally wounded, maddened beyond whatever capacity for restraint a dragon possesses in its final moments. She threw herself against the dome. The dome shattered. The roof came down in pieces, onto the rioters and the dying dragons alike. The greatest structure in King's Landing became rubble and fire and the sound of things ending. Nothing recovered from that night. Syrax died that same night, though not inside the dragon pit. Rhaenyra's own dragon, the dragon she had ridden since childhood, broke free from her handlers in the chaos of the riots. The precise sequence is unclear. Syrax flew toward the dragon pit, toward the fire and the noise, and was killed outside its walls by the mob still pouring through the surrounding streets. Rhaenyra was in the Red Keep when her dragon died. She could not reach her. By the time the night was over, Syrax was gone. Not in battle, not in a dragon engagement, but in the streets of the city Rhaenyra had fought to rule. Killed by those very people she ruled. Rhaenyra understood what the night meant. Not every detail. The full scope of what had been lost would take hours to establish. But the essential fact was clear. The city had turned. Not toward the Greens exactly, not in any organized political sense, but away from her, away from the dragons, away from the war that had brought them to this. A city that rejects you is not a city you can hold. Not with a depleted garrison and an empty treasury and the specific knowledge that the people outside your walls have demonstrated tonight, that they are capable of killing dragons with their bare hands and torches if the alternative is continuing to starve. It was in this atmosphere, weakened militarily, hollowed out politically, increasingly abandoned by the structures that had briefly upheld her, that Rhaenyra fled King's Landing. She had taken the capital once, and now the capital had turned on her. She left by ship, in the dark, with what remained of her household, and what little certainty the war had not yet stripped away. The city she had fought so hard to claim was behind her. Dragonstone lay ahead. She returned to the island where she had been born, where she had ruled, where she had raised her sons, and watched them leave for wars that took most of them. It should have been the place of greatest safety available to her. It was not. She was betrayed in the end by Sir Alfred Broome, a knight of the Dragonstone garrison who had accumulated grievances across years of being passed over for positions and honours he believed he deserved. His betrayal was not ideological. It was the act of a man who had decided that the side he was nominally on had failed to give him sufficient reason to remain on it, and who had found, at this particular moment, a way to convert his resentment into something the other side would value. He delivered Rhaenyra into the hands of her enemies. Aegon II, broken and burned and barely functional, was brought to Dragonstone with Sunfire. What remained of the war converged there. The king who had taken the throne, the queen who had lost it, the dragon that had survived too much, the child who would inherit what was left. Rhaenyra was executed before her surviving son, Aegon the Younger. She had been promised the throne of the Seven Kingdoms, and she had held it for half a year, and she died on the island she had started from, as a Targaryen, consumed by the fire that had always been both her family's gift and its instrument of destruction. The Iron Throne was Aegon's. Whatever that was worth, it was his. The First Battle of Tumbleton had already broken the black position in the Reach. It had already shown what happens when men with dragons decide they are no longer answerable to the side that armed them. It had already burned the town once, shattered confidence in Rhaenyra's rule, and given the Greens a foothold. That foothold looked, from a sufficient distance, like a stabilizing development in a war that had run almost entirely on instability. It was not stabilizing. Hugh and Ulf, in the aftermath of the First Battle of Tumbleton, were a problem the Greens had not anticipated needing to solve. They had anticipated needing dragon riders to defect from the Blacks. They had not fully thought through what those dragon riders would want after the defection. Nor had they thought through what it would mean to have two men with enormous dragons and no actual loyalty to the Green cause sitting in the Reach making demands. Hugh Hammer wanted a crown. He had a dragon larger than anything the Greens could put against him, and he wanted, in return for what that dragon had done at Tumbleton, to be rewarded with a kingdom. Which kingdom was a detail to be worked out. That he deserved a kingdom was, in his view, self-evident. He had changed the course of the war. He had delivered a battle. What did Aegon II have at this point that Hugh Hammer did not, besides a name and a bloodline that his dragon apparently could not distinguish from Hugh's anyway? Ulf the White wanted Highgarden, the ancestral seat of House Tyrell, one of the greatest castles in Westeros, was his preferred reward for services rendered. He was very clear about this. He continued to be very clear about it in the weeks following Tumbleton, in the way that men are clear about things when they are sitting on dragons and have concluded that clarity is available to them. The Green commanders around them looked at Hugh and Ulf and reached a conclusion. Men who betray once are a known quantity. Known quantities are easier to manage when they are no longer present. Ulf the White was poisoned at a feast. There is a simplicity to this that the sources seem almost reluctant to linger on, not because it is morally uncomplicated, but because it is so clean relative to everything else the war had produced. He sat down to eat, and he was given something in his cup, and he died. He had ridden Silverwing through one of the war's turning points, and he died at a dinner table in a town that was still half burned from the engagement he had fought in. Hugh Hammer was not poisoned. whether because the plan to poison him also failed, or because the Green commanders decided a different approach was needed for a man of his physical size and evident suspicion. Sir John Roxton killed him in the fighting that followed and also died in the encounter, because Hugh Hammer was not easy to kill. The Valyrian steel found him and he fell, and Roxton fell with him. The two turn-cloaked dragon riders who had burned Tumbleton and demanded kingdoms were both dead before the second battle had properly begun. The dragons did not know any of this. Vermithor and Silverwing were alive. Their riders were dead. Two riderless dragons in proximity to a military engagement, surrounded by fire and noise and the accumulated chaos of a battle that was now leaderless in ways its commanders had not fully planned for, behaved the way that riderless dragons in those circumstances behave. They fought each other, not out of strategy, not because one side had directed them against the other, because they were dragons without riders, without direction. The instincts that had made them useful weapons turned, in the absence of guidance, into the instincts that make apex predators dangerous to everything in their proximity, including each other. Vermithor and Silverwing locked together above Tumbleton and tore into each other. They did so with relentless ferocity. Vermithor died. Silverwing survived, but not as a weapon anyone still commanded. She would never again be part of any ordered war effort. What Tumbleton left of her belonged to no claimant. Tessarion, Daeron's dragon, the Blue Queen, was wounded in the chaos. She had no more chosen the second battle than Tumbleton's inhabitants had chosen either. She was mortally wounded, suffering, and eventually killed to end what the wounds had started. She died not in combat against an enemy, but because the engagement around her had become something that consumed everything it touched, regardless of which side it theoretically belonged to. Daeron Targaryen died at the Second Battle of Tumbleton. The accounts of how are less specific than they should be for a prince of the realm dying in a named engagement. That tells you something about the nature of the Second Battle of Tumbleton, which was less a military operation than a collapse in the catastrophic sense. When the smoke cleared and the dragons were dead and the fighting had burned itself out for want of anything left to fight over, Daeron was gone. He had been the most honourable of Alicent's sons. He had tried, in the small ways available to someone riding a dragon in a civil war, to be something other than simply an instrument of destruction. He had not chosen to be at Tumbleton. He had not chosen to be in this war. He was born into a family that had made judgments before he was old enough to make his own. Alicent learned what had happened at Tumbleton. She had been present at the centre of everything, increasingly unable to affect any of it. Her eldest son was burned and barely conscious. Her middle son had died above the god's eye. Her daughter was gone. Her grandson had been murdered in the castle she had secured to keep her family safe. And now her youngest son was gone. He was the one who had tried to do it right, who had ridden south and fought carefully and died anyway. She had wanted her children safe. She had put her son on the throne to keep them safe. The war that followed had taken them from her one at a time, with a thoroughness that no amount of political calculation had prepared her to absorb. The throne was Aegon's. What it had demanded to put him there was sitting in front of her now, in the full account. There was nothing left to pay it with. There is a moment in the dance of the dragons when you stop counting victories and defeats and start counting what no longer exists. It arrives at a different point for different observers. Some reach it at the Dragon Pit, some at Tumbleton, some only in the quiet after the war, when someone attempts to catalogue what remains and finds the list shorter than they expected. But it arrives, And when it does, the struggle stops looking like a contest between two claimants to a throne and starts looking like something else. It starts looking like a process of erasure, methodical and irreversible, by which the most remarkable things in the world were removed from it. Before the dance, the Targaryens commanded something in the range of 17 to 20 living dragons. The exact number is disputed even in the sources closest to the events. The chaos of the period did not lend itself to careful census taking. What is not disputed is the order of magnitude. They had more living dragons than any power since the height of Old Valyria. They had enough that losing several in the early engagements felt survivable, felt like the price of a war that was going to be won. By the end, that number was 3. None of those 3 had a rider. This is what happened to the rest. Nettles had bonded with Sheepstealer not through blood, as the theory required, but through patience. She arrived every day with a freshly killed sheep until the dragon decided she was part of his world. She and Daemon Targaryen had operated together through much of the war's middle period, flying raids and harrying green supply lines. They did the unglamorous operational work that sustained a campaign without producing the dramatic engagements that get written about afterward. What developed between them cannot be settled. Whether it was the closeness of people who work and fight together in sustained proximity, whether it was something beyond that, whether the sources that suggest a romantic dimension are reliable or projecting. By the time Rhaenyra, under pressure and losing ground, received reports about Daemon and Nettles that went beyond the military, the reports were enough to produce a move. Rhaenyra sent word that Nettles was to be arrested. The order carried with it the implication, clear enough to everyone who received it, that arrest was the beginning of something that did not end well. Daemon received word before it was carried out. He warned Nettles. She climbed onto Sheepstealer and flew east, away from the war, away from Dragonstone and King's Landing and the Targaryens and everything that had put her in the position of being someone worth arresting. She disappeared into the mountains of the moon, and the sources lose her there. She is one of the few people in the dance whose end is not recorded, which means either that she lived long enough to be forgotten by history, or that history simply did not follow her to wherever she went. Sheepstealer vanished with her. One of the Black's last functional dragon assets gone. Not to enemy fire, not to battle, but to a judgment Rhaenyra made about a woman she had never met, in the last weeks of a reign that was already collapsing. Daemon did not return to Rhaenyra's service after warning Nettles. He flew instead toward a conclusion of his own devising. He issued the challenge in the Old Valyrian tongue, carved into a door near the God's Eye. The God's Eye is the great lake in the Riverlands, ancient and dark and strange in the way that very old bodies of water in contested territory become strange, as though history has settled into them. The message was for Aemon Targaryen. It said, in whatever formulation the Valyrian words produced, that Daemon was there and that Aemon knew what that meant. Aemon knew. He flew to the God's Eye on Vhagar. What happened above the lake is one of the most written about and least clearly witnessed events of the dance. There was no army present. There were no survivors in the immediate vicinity with a clear view of the engagement. What was reconstructed afterward came from people on the distant shores, from the evidence found in the lake's shallows, and from the particular quality of silence that follows events of that magnitude. Caraxes and Vhagar fought above the God's Eye. Caraxes was older than his appearance suggested. He was lean and scarred and experienced in the way of a dragon who had been in difficult situations and survived them. His rider's temperament had influenced something in the beast across years of proximity. Vhagar was vastly larger, the greatest weapon the war had produced. A dragon old enough to have carried the Conqueror's sister into battle a century before. They destroyed each other. Locked together, the accounts suggest they were physically intertwined in the fall, neither willing nor able to disengage. They came down into the God's Eye. Both dragons died. Caraxes apparently made the shore before the end, hauling himself from the water in a final act of something that looked, to the few witnesses, like pure refusal. He died on the bank. Vhagar sank. Aemon's body was found in the shallows of the God's Eye with Dark Sister through the socket of his remaining eye. Dark Sister was Daemon's sword, the Valyrian blade he had carried for decades. Whether Daemon drove it there as they fell, whether it happened in the water, whether it was the final act of a man who had decided exactly how this was going to end, the how of it is less important than the fact of it. Daemon was never found. No body, no final scene. He went into the God's Eye with his dragon, and the lake kept him. Sunfire had been dying since Rook's Rest. The wounds he had taken in that engagement had never healed properly. He flew, because dragons fly when they can, but he flew badly. The time he spent on the ground recovering between flights grew longer as the war continued. He was gold and diminished, the beauty of him compromised by what the fighting had done. He had once been among the most striking creatures alive, and was now the walking evidence of what sustained damage produces. He killed Rhaenyra on Dragonstone. That was his last significant act. Not long after, he too was gone. The sources are imprecise on the interval. The dragon that had secured victory for Aegon II died before the war's last consequences had fully settled. That left Aegon II as something genuinely without precedent in Targaryen history. A king who had won a dragon war and had no dragon. The accounting, laid out plainly, is this. Arrax, killed above Shipbreaker Bay by Vhagar. Lucerys died with him. Stormcloud, mortally wounded during the escape from Dragonstone. His young rider, Aegon the Younger, survived. Vermax lost at the Gullet. Jacaerys died in the same engagement, the precise circumstances unrecorded. Meleys killed at Rook's Rest. Rhaenys died with her. Shrykos, Morgul, Tyraxes, and Dreamfire, killed in the dragon pit by the mob. Tyrax's rider, Joffrey Valerian, died that same night, thrown from his mother's dragon as he tried to reach him. Syrax, killed outside the dragon pit the same night, riderless, in the streets of the city she had lived above. Seasmoke and Vermithor killed at the Second Battle of Tumbleton, the two tearing into each other. Tessarion killed at Tumbleton, mortally wounded in the chaos. Vhagar killed above the God's Eye. Aemon died with her. Caraxes killed above the God's Eye. Daemon lost with him. Sunfire dead of accumulated wounds, sometime after the war that had produced them. Sheepstealer vanished into the mountains of the moon with nettles. Silverwing, riderless, roaming the reach. She would never accept another rider, spending her remaining years avoiding human contact. A dragon that had been in the middle of everything and wanted, apparently, nothing more to do with any of it. Morning, a young dragon bonded to Rhaenyra Targaryen, too young to have flown in the war, too young to represent anything except the possibility of a future that did not arrive. Within one generation of the dance's end, the last Targaryen dragon died, not in battle, not in fire, quietly, of age, in a world that no longer knew quite what to do with dragons and had largely stopped expecting them. It was an ending so poorly recorded that history cannot fix it to a date or a location with any confidence. The Targaryens who came after ruled without them. They were kings and queens of a dynasty that had defined itself through dragonfire for a century, now simply people on a throne made of swords, hoping the swords were enough. The age of dragons had not ended with the doom of Valyria, nor with the death of Balerion, the last of the conqueror's own dragons. It had ended here, in a civil war between two members of the same family. It was fought over a throne that neither of them managed to hold for long, with weapons that were irreplaceable and treated as though they were not. Aegon II had won, which is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is technically true and almost meaningless simultaneously. The claimant he had been fighting was dead. The faction that had opposed him had lost its military coherence. The Iron Throne was his in the full sense. No rival court, no rival queen, no contested claim that anyone with sufficient resources was actively prosecuting. By the definition that wars use to determine their outcomes, Aegon II had won the Dance of the Dragons. What he held was a capital that had burned its own dragon pit, a treasury that had been empty when Rhaenyra took the city and had not improved during the half-year of her reign, or the chaos that followed it. A court composed of people who had served whoever was winning and were now performing loyalty to him with the specific energy of those who are uncertain how long the performance will be required. A body that had been burned at Rook's Rest and never fully healed. He moved with pain, ruled with pain, and had no dragon. Sunfire was dead. He was the first Targaryen king in over a century to sit the Iron Throne without a dragon somewhere beneath him. He was the first for whom the implicit threat that had underwritten Targaryen authority for 100 years was simply absent. He had the throne and the name and the crown, and that's it. He had no heir. His son had been killed by blood and cheese. His other children were dead or too young or otherwise unavailable to the clean succession that a stable reign required. He was a king who had won his war and could not yet say what he had won it for. The future he was supposed to be securing looked, from where he was standing, remarkably unclear. The Black Cause had not entirely collapsed. Aegon the Younger was Rhaenyra's surviving son by Daemon. He was a boy who had watched his mother be eaten by a dragon and had continued to exist afterward in the way that children continue to exist after things that should not happen to children. He was in the hands of Black-Align lords who understood his value. He was not an army. He was not a dragon. He was a boy, traumatized and young, who happened to carry in his blood and his name the legitimate claim of the faction that had just lost its queen. That made him the most important piece on the board that the Black still held. The lords who remained committed to the Black Cause had not surrendered. Those were Tully, the northern forces that had been marching south since Cregan Stark's promise to Jacaerys, and the Vale's contingent. They had lost Rhaenyra. They had not lost the capacity to continue, or the boy whose claim would outlast his mother's if the right settlement could be reached. The war could continue. Both sides knew this. Both sides also knew that continuing had a burden that neither could absorb much more of. The realm had been fighting for close to 2 years. The riverlands were devastated. The harvest had failed or been burned or simply not been gathered because the people who gathered them had been conscripted or killed or had fled. King's Landing was plague-ridden and hungry and had burned its dragons. The great lords who had committed their houses to one side or the other were looking at their depleted armies and their damaged lands. They were beginning to perform the calculation that exhausted belligerents eventually perform. That is the calculation where you ask what winning actually gets you and compare that honestly to what continuing costs. Cregan Stark arrived at King's Landing with a northern army. He came because of a promise. It was the oath Jacaerys had extracted from him at Winterfell, which Cregan had made in the Northern Way, that made it a personal obligation to be honored. Jacaerys was dead. Rhaenyra was dead. The war had produced its outcome without him. None of this changed what Cregan believed he owed. He arrived to find a city that had survived the dance in the way that things survive fires. Present, recognizable in outline, fundamentally altered in ways that would take years to fully understand. He arrived with an army that was fresh, unbloodied, and had marched a very long way. In a city full of people who had been fighting or managing or suffering through 2 years of civil war, a fresh northern army was not an abstract force. It was visible, immediate, and in the hands of a man who had not been here for any of it. He did not share in the exhaustion that had softened everyone else's edges. Cregan was made Hand of the King. Briefly, formally, in the strange interlude that followed the war's end before stable governance could be established. He served in that position for a single day. The day is remembered as the hour of the wolf. In that day, he moved with the efficiency of a man who had come a very long way to do something specific and intended to do it before anyone persuaded him not to. He identified those most responsible for the war's worst acts on the green side. Those were acts that had gone beyond the ordinary crimes of warfare. He arrested them. He convened judgments. He moved through the wreckage of the Green Court with the authority of someone who had not been compromised by proximity to any of it, who owed nothing to the factions that had survived, and who had a large army outside the walls. Most of those arrested were given the choice between execution and taking the black, joining the Night's Watch, and removing themselves from the political world permanently. Several chose the Watch. A few did not survive the choice. Cregan Stark then resigned the handship and handed the governance of a shattered realm back to people who would need to rebuild it. He prepared to march his army home. He had come to honor an oath. He had honored it. The North had its own concerns, its own winter coming. Aegon II died before the political settlement was complete. He was poisoned. That much is established by the sources that deal with it, which agree on the method and agree on almost nothing else. Who administered it is not recorded. In this context, that means either that the perpetrator was skilled enough to avoid leaving evidence, or that the people who might have investigated had their own reasons for not pursuing the question to its conclusion. The list of people with sufficient motive to want Aegon II dead at that specific moment was extensive enough to be unhelpful as an investigative tool. He had enemies who had survived the war. He had allies who were calculating what his continued presence cost them, relative to what his absence enabled. He had made decisions during his reign that had left marks on people who were still alive and still in proximity to his food and drink. He died. He had held the Iron Throne for less than 3 years. He had won the war and had not lived long enough to do much with the winning. Aegon the Younger was placed on the Iron Throne. He was 6 years old. He had watched his mother die. He would rule eventually, once the regency that governed in his name had done the work of stitching together something functional from what the dance had left. He would rule for decades, and he would rule without joy. That is perhaps the most honest possible response to having inherited what he had inherited. He was called Aegon the Dragonbane. The epithet was not incidental. He feared them, genuinely, deeply, in the way that children fear things that have given them direct and personal reason to. He had seen what dragons did to his mother. He had been in proximity to dragon violence at an age when that proximity leaves marks that do not heal cleanly. Whether he feared them because they had destroyed his mother, or whether he would have feared them regardless, the sources suggest the former. The boy who sat on the Iron Throne carried with him a terror acquired on Dragonstone that no amount of time fully erased. The remaining dragons were Silverwing, riderless and retreating from human contact. Mourning, too young to fly in the war, too young to be anything yet. Sheep-stealer, gone with nettles into the mountains. They died over the years and decades that followed, without producing the next generation that might have sustained the line. No new eggs hatched that survived. No new bonds formed that lasted. The last Targaryen dragon died during Aegon III's reign, poorly recorded and unremarked at the time. It was not recognized as the ending that it was. It was just another dragon, gone. Wars end. Their consequences do not. The Dance of the Dragons concluded with a poisoned king, a traumatized child on the throne, and a realm that had been fighting itself for the better part of 2 years. What came after was not peace in any full sense of the word. It was the cessation of organized violence, which is a different and lesser thing. The killing stopped. The damage remained in forms that ranged from the physical and immediate to the slow, generational kind that takes decades to fully surface. To understand what the dance extracted, you have to look at it from several directions simultaneously. There is the human toll, which was enormous and largely unrecorded. There are the political consequences, which reshaped the dynasty in ways that did not fully manifest for generations. And there is the reckoning borne by the people who had been at the center of it. Not the counts of the dead, but the specific individual accounting of those who had wanted this and got it, and found that getting it looked nothing like what they had imagined. The Riverlands did not recover quickly. They had been the primary land theatre of the war. They were the place where armies marched and camped and foraged and burned, where the logic of sustained military campaigning expressed itself most directly on the landscape and the people living in it. The estimates that exist are not reliable in the way that modern figures are reliable, but they point in a consistent direction. Significant portions of the Riverlander population were dead, displaced, or reduced to a subsistence that would take years to climb back from. Crops had been burned, not once but repeatedly, as the front moved back and forth and each side denied the other the resources the region produced. Villages had been abandoned. Castles had changed hands with a frequency that left them damaged and their surrounding communities without the stability that lords tend to provide simply by being consistently present. King's Landing had lost a fraction of its population that the sources gesture at without quantifying. The losses came from conflict, from plague, from the specific mortality of a city under blockade and stress that had lacked the means to address what was killing it. The dragon pit stood open to the sky. The markets that had made the capital function had contracted. The merchant class that had sustained the city's economic life had, in significant numbers, found reasons to be elsewhere during the worst of it, and had not all returned. Beyond the physical, there was the subtler harm of a realm that had watched its ruling dynasty fight itself to near destruction, and had drawn conclusions from the watching. Alicent Hightower survived the dance. She had been in the Red Keep from the beginning. She was present at the center of every judgment. The woman whose belief in her son's right to rule had helped set everything in motion. She had outlasted the war. She had not outlasted it well. Under the regency that governed in Aegon III's name, Alicent's position in the Red Keep shifted from Queen Mother to something closer to a prisoner who was not formally called one. She was kept. She was not consulted. The lords who now managed the realm's recovery had no particular use for the woman most associated with the faction that had started the war. They demonstrated this with the cruelty of powerful people who are simply not interested in someone, not actively persecuting her, but making her irrelevance structural and permanent. She lived for years in this condition, in the castle she had fought to hold, among the consequences of the actions she had taken. She had wanted her children safe. Her son was dead, poisoned in the throne room she had secured for him. Her youngest son was dead in the Reach. Her daughter was believed to have taken her own life in the castle's upper floors. Her grandson had been murdered in the nursery. The throne was occupied by the son of the woman she had displaced, being governed by men who had no interest in her counsel. What Alicent had built across a lifetime of careful, costly maneuvering was the precise outcome she had given everything to prevent. Her family was diminished, her enemies ascendant, her children gone. The war had not punished her with imprisonment or execution. It had given her something harder, survival long enough to see the full account of what she had set in motion. The political consequences of the dance operated on a longer timescale than the human ones. The Targaryens survived. The dynasty continued, which is not nothing. Many dynasties that fight civil wars of this scale do not. Aegon III ruled. His children ruled after him. The line persisted for nearly 2 more centuries before Robert's rebellion ended it. But the dynasty that persisted was not the dynasty that had entered the war. Something had broken. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that things break when they are placed under sufficient stress and then continue to be used. The Targaryens had ruled on the implicit understanding that they were different from other families, that their dragons made them not merely more powerful, but categorically apart. Without dragons, that understanding had to be maintained through the ordinary instruments of rule. Those instruments are political skill, military strength, the cultivation of loyalty. They are instruments that other dynasties possess too. They are not categorical advantages. The great lords who had survived the dance had watched the Targaryens fight each other with the full force of their power and emerged diminished. They had seen Targaryen dragons killed by mobs. They had seen Targaryen kings poisoned by their own courts. They had seen the dynasty's most fundamental asset, the thing that had justified everything and underwritten the entire political order, gone within a single generation. The conclusion available from this evidence was not that the Targaryens were finished, but they were, for the first time, legible as something that could be vulnerable. That precedent would take nearly 2 centuries to be acted upon. It existed, though. It waited in the political imagination of every great lord who came after, in the knowledge that the dynasty had once been brought to its knees by its own hand, and could be again. Rhaenyra Targaryen had been dead for months before the war ended. She is worth returning to here, not because her death was strategically significant. It changed nothing about the military situation and produced no political consequence that can be clearly traced. But she is the clearest example of what the dance actually was. She had chosen no side. She had wanted nothing from the war. She had been a mother and a wife, and, by the accounts that survive, a woman with an interior life that the world around her had never been particularly interested in accommodating. The fighting found her anyway. It put her in a room with 2 men and asked her which of her sons she could bear to lose. Then it took the one she chose to protect and left to her with the knowledge of that exchange for whatever time she had remaining. She had been destroyed by actions taken by other people, in pursuit of goals she had never shared, using her children as instruments of a war she had not started and could not stop. It was not strategy, nor glory, nor the pursuit of rightful inheritance that defined the dance for most of the people inside it. it looked like Helena in that room, and the years afterward, and the end that the years produced. The war had a winner. It did not have anyone who won. The dance of the dragons lasted less than 2 years. In the span of a dynasty that ruled for nearly 3 centuries, 2 years is a small thing. It is a troubled passage between calmer waters, a wound that closed and left a scar. That is one way to measure it. The other way is to look at what existed before those 2 years and what existed after, and to sit with the distance between those two pictures. Before there were 20 dragons, a dynasty defined by something no other family possessed, a political order built on the assumption that Targaryen power was not merely dominant, but categorically different from every other kind of power in the world. After, there were 3 dragons, all riderless or vanished, none of them capable of producing the next generation that might have sustained the line. A traumatized child on the throne. A realm that had watched the dynasty consume itself and drawn the conclusions that watching produces. Within 1 generation, the last dragon was gone. The distance between those 2 pictures is the dance of the dragons, and the question worth asking at the end of all of it is how, not how in the military sense. The battles have been covered, the betrayals documented, the deaths counted. How in the deeper sense? How does a dynasty at the absolute peak of its power, in possession of advantages so complete, come within a generation of destroying itself entirely? The answer begins with a man who would not make a difficult judgment. Viserys I was not a villain. He was not incompetent. He was a king who loved his daughter, who made a promise to her in front of the whole realm, and who then spent the rest of his life refusing to confront the consequences of that promise. He refused to settle what it meant for the sons who came after. He refused to acknowledge the conflict building in his own court. He refused to do the hard and painful thing that might have secured peace for everyone who came after him. He chose comfort over clarity, consistently and until the end. The war he never fought in and never intended was the direct consequence of that pattern of avoidance. Every person who died in the dance died downstream of a man who wanted, more than anything, not to have a difficult conversation. Viserys alone does not explain it, though. The dance required participation. It required people to choose it, not once, but repeatedly, at every juncture where a different path was available. Alicent chose to hear what she needed to hear in a dying man's words, and then acted on that interpretation before anyone could contest it. Aemond chose to follow Lucerys out over Shipbreaker Bay, when no one had ordered him to, and nothing required it. Daemon chose to send 2 men into the Red Keep to kill a child, when the political logic of the moment did not demand it, and the human price of it was obvious and complete. Hugh Hammer and Ulf the White chose the rewards available to them over the loyalty they had accepted. Sir Alfred Broome chose resentment over obligation. Lord Boros Baratheon chose the better offer. Each of these turns was made by a person who believed, with whatever degree of sincerity the moment allowed, that they were doing what the situation required. Each was consequential. Much of it could have unfolded differently. What the dance shows, across all of it, is that catastrophes of this scale are not produced by fate or by the iron logic of historical forces. They are produced by actions, small ones and large ones, taken by people who might have moved differently, accumulating into an outcome that none of them individually intended, and all of them collectively created. Rhaenyra had the stronger legal claim. She had the oaths and the precedent of her father's own declaration. She also lost. Aegon II had a throne taken in a coup, a reign built on speed rather than legitimacy, a claim that required the realm to set aside what it had formerly sworn. He also won. And then he was poisoned, and his dragon was dead, and his children were dead, and the throne went to Rhaenyra's son anyway. The boy she had been trying to secure it for inherited it through the wreckage of everything both his parents had done. The war did not decide which claim was right. It decided which claim was left. The dragon pit still stands on Rhaenys' hill, present, recognizable, emptied of everything that made it what it was. The dome that Dreamfire shattered was never rebuilt. The fires that burned inside it were never relit. The dragons that made it the most important structure in the city are bones somewhere, in the rubble beneath it, in the shallows of the God's Eye, in the waters off Shipbreaker Bay, in soil across the Reach, and the Riverlands and the Crownlands. People walk past it. They have been walking past it for centuries. It is part of the city's landscape now, so familiar that it has stopped being a monument and become simply a feature. The way that old wounds become simply part of the body. But it was, once, the place where the greatest concentration of dragons in the world was housed. The physical center of a power that had no equal. And it was destroyed not by an enemy, not by a foreign army, not by any force that came from outside the family that built it. It was destroyed by the people whose responsibility it was to protect it, by their hunger and their grief and their resentment and their turns, the long chain of actions that started with a man who wanted a quiet life and ended with a mob and torches on a hill above a city that was dying. The dome is open to the sky now. Rain gets in. Birds nest in the upper tiers where the stone is still standing. It is a place that was built to be permanent and became instead a lesson about power, about the assumptions that accumulate around it, about what tends to happen when the people who hold the most extraordinary advantages treat those advantages as guaranteed rather than fragile. Nothing is guaranteed. The Targaryens had dragons. They had more dragons at the moment this war began than the world had seen in centuries. 2 years, that was all it took. And then the sky was empty, and it stayed that way.